All right, it's the first day of the year, and it's time to talk about Huawei. So, it's kind of been out of the news for a little bit, but Huawei is a major Chinese company, and we're going to talk really quick about what has happened to it in this last rather brutal year for the company and kind of what that means for everything going forward. So, let's do a quick recap of what exactly Huawei is. So, Huawei, Huawei, is a major Chinese electronics and IT and tech company, basically. So its history basically started in around late 1980s. A former PLA engineering officer started this company, which unsurprisingly built the first People's Liberation Army national telecom network, but that doesn't really matter. And Huawei quickly became part of the Chinese government's effort to substitute foreign technologies for local technologies. So anytime you're industrializing, you always are sort of stuck with the problem that you need to use a lot of foreign technologies because you don't have those technologies. And there's a whole basically failed type of theory of how to industrialize. It's called import substitution industrialization. What that is about starting to use all these non-foreign technologies that you sort of develop yourself and you sort of ascend up the industrial hierarchy. That really doesn't work out. But along the way, every country is always trying to do as much indigenously as possible. China being one of the most, the largest sort of countries that do that. And Huawei and many other companies got a part of that, particularly in the 1990s. A whole swaths of companies across the Chinese tech space became national champions. And that happened for Huawei, the mid 1990s. Huawei and another company also involved in the telecom business called ZTE both became basically the official national champions of China. These were the two companies, the main companies that were going to try and really muscle their way into the telecom business. And if people don't remember, the late 90s, the mid 90s, this was both sort of the telecom bubble and the tech bubble, the sort of original, the OG internet bubble of the late 90s. It was a crazy world at that time. So China definitely didn't want to be seen as missing out on this whole thing. So for many reasons, Huawei and ZT got in on the game. And basically, they muscled and expanded, and Huawei muscled and expanded its way into being a major global tech company. It bought a lot of foreign assets. It also developed its own and copied and then innovated on products that were being created all around the world and assembled in China, all sorts of stuff like that. And Huawei was initially focused on telecom equipment. So this is sort of the really boring back end stuff that makes phone calls go where they're supposed to go, cell phone calls go where they're supposed to go, and then all of the technologies around it, sort of the routing infrastructure and everything related to that we're hearing a lot about with 5G as the world tries to put into place sort of a new next generation mobile telecom infrastructure. But this was initially what China did, or what Huawei focused on, and it was subsidized by the Chinese state to win a large share of the global telecom market. Late 90s, a bunch of companies all around the world failed. A really spectacular one was probably Nortel in Canada, which had an insane percentage of the Toronto Stock Exchange was entirely, held by the capitalization of Nortel, which then it blew up and it became a whole disaster. But this is one of those things where all these companies were dying, and this was a really great market for China to try and get in on, especially when it knew how important telecom was, and it was also massively expanding its own infrastructure within China. So that's really important, and it really worked. So even in 2021, when after all the brouhaha over 5G has been going on in Huawei, 5G and Huawei has been going on for years now. It still has around 30%. Huawei still has around 30% of the global telecom market for telecom equipment. And if you add in ZTE, the other company, you're looking at close to 50%. So it really took this market, and it's a big one. There's a lot of industries people are very worried about that China has a lot of almost a dominant influence in: rare earths, some of the battery and electric car supply chain. This is also a really key one, and this one it's very much true. That's the main thing. And then also in the 2000s, Huawei started to get into the handset business. So before mobile phones were really cool and became the ubiquitous thing that we all know and love, Huawei was already in on this business. So it was doing it again, early on when they were really lame and there was like Blackberries and there was stuff like that. So it had actually been in the business a very, very long time, even though it only came out onto the West radar and only really came out. It seemed to come onto the scene in the sort of mid 2000s. It had been in it for a long time. And by the 2010s, Huawei was a very, very, very big company. So in 2020, I mean, it had nearly $140 billion in revenue and almost 200,000 employees. So this is a massive, massive operation. But disaster has struck, and this year, Huawei's revenue fell by 30%. So that puts it below 100 billion, and it erases 4 years of growth. And anyone who's tried to make up losses in gambling or anything knows it's really, really, really hard to make up these losses. It's much harder than, you go down 30%, you just come back up 30%. It's actually much, much harder due to the pains of compounding and the inverse, kind of the pains of compounding in this context. And this is a really, really big thing. So there's been a lot of, since the Trump trade war happened, and basically the Trump confrontational posture with China reset things and sort of put us on a new political course. Everyone's been trying to figure out, is this going to work? Is it not going to work? What's going to happen? Are we dependent? Are we all too interconnected? What's going to happen? Well, the Huawei situation is a really good example to sort of just think about what's going on. And it matters, of course, because of competitiveness and because of the supposed virtues and values and great benefits of 5G, basically just because of that. And this is a big thing. Losing that much revenue, I mean, this puts Huawei. I mean, Huawei was on the path to being a really enormous dominant company. I mean, it had tens of billions of dollars in basically free loans from the Chinese government. It had a really weak telecom market to come muscle into, whereas it's facing companies like Ericsson and Nokia, which got decimated in the handset market, but still trundles on in the telecom equipment market. So it really wasn't that much of competition. But when you get hit with a major government, it's just a very different thing. I mean, so everyone's always talking about how corporations are the worst thing in the world. They can be tyrannical and they run so much of our lives, and all that is really true in a lot of ways. But also, we can't forget that a government can just destroy corporations basically whenever it wants. And obviously, if you're a poor sort of African country and ExxonMobil is in town, that doesn't really feel that way. But let's say you're even a major, enormous Chinese state company and you get targeted by the U.S. government, you really quickly realize that is the way the world works, right? So the good old monopoly on the use of force. What happened to Huawei and what could happen to a lot of companies is totally a use of force. It's not like pretend it isn't. Whether you agree with it or don't agree with it or think it's totally worthless or is a great idea, it should be expanded to all sorts of Chinese companies, doesn't matter. You got to remember, governments are insanely powerful. Powerful governments of powerful nations are insanely powerful, even if they don't seem really competent all the time. They're really powerful. So let's just go over really quick. What did the U.S. do? What exactly did it hit Huawei with? Well, all sorts of stuff. Back in 2019, it put Huawei on the Entity List, which is basically a big list of companies that can't do business with U.S. organizations or use U.S. financial system. There's all sorts of different types and stuff that happens there. That's a big one. A really major thing. It also had Canada arrest Huawei's CFO and then tried to extradite her to the U.S. for breaking sanctions. A lot of this stemmed from Huawei breaking sanctions related to Iran. So basically, the U.S. was sanctioning another country, and a foreign company broke those sanctions and is getting sanctioned for breaking the sanctions, and that's what happens. And actually, the CFO, the Huawei CFO, she was actually recently let go as part of the Biden administration's attempt to basically calm some things, and it just really didn't need to be done, I guess you could say. Basically, Huawei's really, we'll get into how Huawei's really, really struggling, and having the CFO, not having the CFO, who I believe was like the daughter or maybe the daughter of the founder and CEO of Huawei, but that doesn't matter. I mean, it just didn't seem necessary anymore. It was very much a statement move, political move back in beforehand. And so people don't remember, this actually led to a huge brouhaha with Canada. A couple Canadian, I think, journalists were held in China. It was a very bad thing for them. And, it also showed the limits of what China could do, because it didn't exactly go arrest the CFO of Apple or any other American company. But that doesn't really matter. And just adding some more things that the U.S. did, the really major one was that it put export controls on companies that could trade with Huawei. So this was a really big one. It really enforced this really seriously. And basically that meant that Huawei could no longer use U.S. chips or U.S. software design tools or U.S. phone operating systems. So that's, Huawei lost the ability to use Android in the consumer phone market, the consumer mobile phone market, which basically is a death sentence. If you're not Apple, you basically have to use Android. That's the only other major option. And Huawei lost that. And of course, the U.S. also began a global campaign against Huawei's 5G infrastructure systems due to their ability to collect data. And there's all sorts of other things. I mean, the number of things going on against Huawei is massive. It's accused of doing all these things and being associated with everything going on in Xinjiang or facilitating it or using its infrastructure to support it, stuff like that. And yeah, I mean, the really major one was this 5G infrastructure systems, which 5G is a much more powerful network basically, and it can supposedly collect a lot of data, and the control over the core certain elements of the infrastructure could give a company like Huawei or the Chinese government, if it was given certain access to things, all sorts of information about a country, about the population, about the movements, about all sorts of things, about the people, even about the military capacities, positioning, electronic signals, data for military airplanes, just like a whole set of things that people were worried about. Some of it's not true, some of it is true, some of it is hypothetical, some of it is very much real, but either way, 2021 was really the first year where Huawei was subject to these total U.S. export controls, and where it was really pushed in 2020 as well, but everyone was kind of distracted by the pandemic, pushed in against, everyone was pushing, the U.S. was pushing against Huawei in basically every single sort of major company, major country that was trying to, put out its 5G system. So that's Germany, that's the UK, that's all of these countries. And the U.S. is basically saying, just trying to make it hard for them. Don't pick Huawei, pick us or Huawei. Don't pick Huawei, pick us or Huawei. And this is really tough for countries because Huawei is the cheapest. ZTE and Huawei are the cheapest because they're subsidized to be the cheapest. This is sort of the way it worked. And realistically, Ericsson and Nokia just aren't the same level of company, although they are pretty lucky now that they have this whole wind at the back. But one of the net results of this, we'll get to the telecom later, but the really primary one is that Huawei's entire smartphone business is basically being destroyed. So it was I think it was around 2018 it became the largest, it overtook Apple, I think, as the largest manufacturer, the largest phone manufacturer in China, the one who had the most sales. And this year is booted out of the top 5 smartphone manufacturers in a very, very tough Chinese smartphone market. And meanwhile, Apple has once more surged to the top. It has maybe like a quarter of the market, although it takes so much of the profit. That's what people should be looking at. But whatever, it has the 25% market share. And this is really galling to Huawei because it had overtaken Apple, thought it was on the route to being just this globally preeminent sort of tech company. And that really isn't the case. Although realistically, just the Chinese smartphone market is so saturated and so difficult and so cutthroat that wasn't the worst thing in the world, but it was a huge component of Huawei's ambitions. Huawei has 3 basically businesses. It has this infrastructure telecom business, it has a consumer business, and then it has kind of has a like cloud storage data sort of business, right? Those are minor. Telecom, and then basically the consumer business, which has phones and laptops and tablets, all that kind of stuff. And there's no way and the smartphone market was the most high profile one. It was the one where it was pushing up against major global, well-known, recognized tech brands like Samsung and Apple. This was a huge thing. It was really seen also in China and the Chinese social media as like a major coming out party for not just a large Chinese company, right? But a really large, tech company. This is a really big thing. This is the frontier. Every country is trying to have their companies be on the technological frontier and competing on the technological frontier. And Huawei was really one of those companies that just felt like one of the absolute world beaters in the Chinese market. But now it's really different. It's been banned from using U.S. software, so it doesn't have the Android operating system anymore. That means it doesn't really have the I can't do any of this stuff. I mean, technically, I'm not actually sure, but I'm based on the data. I mean, based on the law, you probably can't use Windows either. I mean, for PCs and stuff like that. So Huawei is stuck. I mean, it's trying to create its own operating system. I think it's called Harmony OS. But this is not a viable product outside of China. First of all, Huawei is not a software company. I mean, has not operated a software, like an operating system, a computer operating system for 10, 15, 20 or 30 years, like Apple and Microsoft and Google for 10, 15 years. That's a very different game that Huawei's never played, and there's no reason to believe it'll be globally competitive. It'll be able to compete with Android or with iOS or with Android or with any Windows or Linux even on desktops and laptops. There's no reason to think that this will actually work out, but has really no choice. And a lot of this is again basically Huawei. We'll get into it a little bit. I mean, Huawei is becoming more of a Chinese company, and this smartphone business, these new operating systems might be very important within China, right? If the United States government can just remove one company using major operating systems around the world, this is a bad deal for China. Maybe it could happen to all sorts of different companies. Maybe it could even happen to the whole country, right? China doesn't allow all sorts of things into the country using its Great Firewall. Maybe the U.S. could do the same thing and just not allow things into the country in the same way, right? That gets into a whole back and forth. Well, maybe China will do this, it'll do it'll do rare earth, it'll do that, and it'll do this and that. And that's a whole thing, not worth getting into right now. But this operating system it was just such a death blow because everyone always assumes, oh my God, everything the U.S. tech advantage is gone. It's been eroded along with the movement of production capacity from the United States to places like China. But the truth is, a lot of although it is a sliver. I mean, realistically, you should have kept a lot of this stuff here. Whatever. The high end sliver of this whole value chain, whether it's the software design, chip design, or operating systems, is still held in the U.S. and actually gives a lot of leverage over companies and countries like China. And really quickly, this telecom business, which is the core of this fight, right? Right now, Huawei is fighting a political battle in basically every country against the U.S. that the U.S. cares about to whether it can install and operate their 5G systems. And this is, there's sort of there's two parts to basically telecom equipment infrastructure. There's sort of a core element. There's the core part of it, and there's sort of like more of the periphery systems. And it's a lot of this is probably assuming that Huawei is going to be able to do stuff in the core when it's really doing more peripheral systems, and that doesn't really matter. But the point of all this is that while Huawei is always going to be, probably not, maybe not always, but it's going to be for a long time a major part of the telecom business, the world's kind of getting split, right? Ericsson and Nokia. Yes, Nokia, which totally got blown out in the handset business, is still alive and still around, and it still has this back-end telecom equipment infrastructure business. Crazy as it sounds, but as it sounds, like a company like Nokia is probably not the world's, the most world-beating company in this sector. And unfortunately, Ericsson, great company, great name, whatever. It's really not the same. It doesn't have the same vision, integrity, the sort of long-standing purpose, and just not the same energy basically that Huawei or honestly American tech companies have as well. This is very different, but nonetheless, they basically have a lock on a lot of markets now. Very weird situation. I mean, a lot of people have said maybe the U.S. should buy one of these companies. The U.S. government can't buy one, and a lot of the tech companies probably don't want one. First of all, it puts you straight, head to head against the Chinese government, in kind of in the center of this giant conflict. And of course, it's not the most high margin thing in the world. China does want this in part because you get all sorts of data, you get all sorts of information, and you get this sort of back-end infrastructure. Like, it's really useful. And everyone's been worried for a long time. Well, China's building ports and electrical grids and telecom networks and railroads and everything. I mean, is it basically getting a lock on all these countries? And yes, that is the plan, of course. I mean, having, if someone, it's like your landlord. It's like you can't really push your landlord away from every single system that you use, whether it's the water or the electricity or everything. You kind of have to call them for help when it breaks down. So that's definitely been the plan. But, it works to different degrees in different countries. But at least in the telecom space for major Western countries, this doesn't look like it's going to work. It's going to really boost a lot of the the Ericssons and Nokias of the world, which is unfortunate. Probably means higher prices for consumers and governments and everyone trying to set up these systems. But the honest thing we should all be prepared for is if you're going to start going against China in all these different ways, you're going to get more expensive prices, right? That is the cost of this whole thing. And in general, the era of like endlessly cheap manufactured goods is probably ending. That the massive deflationary effect of China in the global economy, it's tapping out for a lot of reasons anyway. But this is definitely accelerating that trend. So that's just the nature of what's happening. And for Huawei, this is its route to becoming more of a Chinese company, right? It's always been a really Chinese company. I mean, it's very well connected with the Chinese military, and that's always been a part of it. But more, what I mean is this is a good example of the limits of Chinese corporate global ambitions, right? So if you lose basically all the Anglo countries, so that's like Australia and the UK, and I think the UK is doing it now in sort of a minor sense, and then New Zealand, Australia, US, all that, and you lose a lot of Europe, you could always be there. But what's happening also is that all these companies are trying to make sure that they have, they can, if they do use Huawei, they can also use Ericsson, they can also use Nokia. They're trying to make sure these systems are more plug and play, they're more interoperable, they're not these totally closed, you rely on us sort of systems, which is probably a good policy for anyone doing IT stuff or infrastructure stuff in general. It may push in that direction. Again, it's kind of unknown. The scale of these things and the build out is a bit unknown. So that is what's going on. But for Huawei, it's just showing the limits of this, right? You can't make up for, people pretend like you can. They pretend like you can make up for Western Europe in these really high, or Japan or Taiwan or Korea, in these sort of advanced high income nations where people pay a lot for things, with Africa and Latin America, the Middle East, and places like that. But that just isn't the case. Like if you look at a company like Netflix, for example, it charges whatever, 11 or whatever in the United States, and then you go to other places and it charges different numbers. And if you look at sort of the breakdown of sort of the average, revenue per average user in all these different parts of the world, you'll see that the vast majority of the revenue comes from the United States, North America, and Western Europe, and it has this massive global presence around the world, but doesn't make the same amount of money there, right? And that's not necessarily a bad thing. If all these countries were to develop, blah blah blah, this is the whole development narrative. But again, this is for a totally different episode. But we're way beyond that now. Countries that have developed, and the ones that haven't are, we're not in a world where it's going to be very easy to do so anymore. A lot of the things that made it possible for China to appear in the world and develop are gone. So you'll need new strategies, and nobody knows what those are. So that's a really tough thing. But this is, in this world, companies like Huawei become national champions. And China was kind of ready for this from the beginning. They knew, in the 90s especially, they knew we're going to need a lot of national champions. They just saw the color revolutions, everything going on. And basically, the Soviet Union was falling, and all these countries in Eastern Europe were becoming democratic. They were overthrowing their governments. It seemed like chaos. It seemed like all the dominoes were falling, and all communist countries would fail and fall. And China knew it needed real strength, and it knew it needed companies to do it because the state couldn't do everything. The state was failing at the time and basically doing whole swaths of basic things. So it was using companies to move things forward and want to control those companies and want to be national champions. And now you get to a place where you do have national champions, but when you have a company like Huawei that used to be close to $150 billion company, now, it's 2/3 of that, and the ability to get back there is changing. This is different. This is what I've said a couple times. The expectations of companies are going to have to change, right? So Apple, talking about global this or an American company that, Apple, I think is the most valuable company in the world. I think 20% of its iPhones were sold in China. Like if you start removing that, it's kind of hard to see how this is a haircut across the spectrum. But if we move in this direction, that's what's happening. Companies have to be national champions. And unfortunately, the U.S. a lot of people in the U.S. are really upset by this now because a lot of people think that the U.S. lost its champions, right? Everything was financialized, everything was sold off, there's nothing here, everything was outsourced. In a lot of senses, this was true, right? This was a huge part of the story of globalization. But we are moving into a new phase, and a lot of companies did die, but also new companies ideally would form or should form. That is the way things should go. We'll see how it all happens, but that is what's happening. And I won't say that Ericsson or Nokia are going to be sort of national champions. The problem with this new world is that multinational companies were able to be everywhere and everything to everyone. And actually, this is part of the reason people are so afraid of them for a while, is because they seem like they were above and beyond all other all other countries even. And that was never really the case. If you're dealing with a strong country, if you're dealing with a weak country, it was pretty much the case. You could just do whatever you want there. You go end up through international courts, and you didn't ever get hit that bad unless really bad litigation came at you. But a company like Ericsson or Nokia, part of these sort of Canadian or Scandinavian countries, they're not going to be national champions for anything, right? There's no national champion if you're a small European country or basically any other country besides the United States, China, maybe. Unfortunately, that's kind of it. This is sort of the problem, and this is the reason a lot of Europeans, if they listen to someone like me talking about this stuff, it seems very dicey of a world to live in, because every country in Europe is smaller than the United States or China, and a lot of European history is European countries fighting each other, not coming together. And briefly in the last couple decades, they were able to do so. They were able to make really large companies and do all this, but there are no real even European champions in a lot of industries, particularly high-tech ones. So it's a really dicey thing, but this is, again, still the limits of Chinese ambition, global ambitions, and really a lot of the limits of global ambitions writ large, as the world sort of hives off into various sects. But that's sort of the way it is. And let's just talk really quickly. Can Huawei even do, what can it do from here? What can you do if you're Huawei, right? How do you get back to being a potentially $150 billion company in this sort of environment? And this is a really instructive thing to look at, because I've been saying for a while that countries and companies are going to have to learn to deal with a very new world. And the companies that are learning to deal with it first are actually right now a lot of Chinese companies, because they're dealing with the problems of, like I've said, the U.S. can smack all sorts of really painful sanctions on companies and countries and individuals, and you have to learn to deal with it. And a company like Huawei, which is so big, although it's so state-inflected that it's not totally private and stuff, but whatever, still you have to respond to these acts, right? These painful sort of situations, basically. And, well, what is it doing, right? So Huawei is trying to kind of boost its consumer, right? So I said there's three parts to it. It has that telecom business, which is going to go strong, but you're never going to become a insanely even well-known company if you're running on 5G and everything is like a political battle in the world, and the rest of the world's going to support Ericsson and Nokia to keep them alive, or they'll get bought by someone or turn conglomerates or whatever. That's never going to get you where you want to go entirely. So the two other segments, consumer and then sort of the cloud, data services, storage, stuff like that. The major one is the consumer market, right? So Huawei's trying to move into the Internet of Things and wearables and car technologies and chips and more consumer technologies, basically all across the board. Anything that sounds like a hypey buzzword, it's going to try to do. The problem is, so is everybody else, right? And this is just tough. You would need, again, the Chinese government's massive support for this sort of thing. But a lot of the reason the Chinese government was supporting all this stuff is because you were gaining external markets, and you were able to push production over a massive and a much larger quantity of people. And so it was hitting a lot of economic and strategic and internal technology goals. It was doing all these things at once. And just pursuing blithely all sorts of new technologies could do that, but you need to win the markets. You need to actually get the massive sales as a result of it. And it's a bit dicey. Everyone wants to do the Internet of Things, right? Why? It's really tough, and doesn't really have brands anymore. Huawei has kind of a really tainted brand in general. This whole thing was partially a reputational attack, and it worked. And so it had to sell this Honor smartphone brand that it had to another Chinese company to sort of save that and let that smartphone brand continue to live. I think it actually got, obviously probably got some money selling it as well to keep things afloat. But all this stuff, car technologies, this is just endless. There's like 100, I don't even know. There was like almost hundreds for a while, electric car companies in China. Almost everyone building the chips and the guts and all the stuff for this. This is tough. And obviously building chips in China is this same technological nationalism you see in the United States and China, where Huawei is trying to get in, like Intel in the United States, at building chips for China, right? So where Huawei really goes from here is basically being that Chinese national tech champion, and it's returning to its roots of helping China to basically deal with its foreign dependence on all sorts of on foreign technologies. I mean, this was a company that was supposed to be created to deal with this, and it kind of got almost killed by it, right? So the Chinese government was not wrong that the foreign tech dependence is it's a difficult thing to deal with, but also struggled entirely to deal with it all. I mean, China's done a lot of things to improve its dependence on from other countries. It's done a lot of things, but as it's developed and expanded, the things it just needs more and more things. So this is a case of like whack-a-mole where you can't have everything. You just can't. You can try. Now it's really tough because you have pushback everywhere. In the 90s, 2000s to the mid 2010s, China could just push and try and expand into all these different markets and all these different areas and gain all these strategic access and control of different industries and all that. Now everyone sees what you're doing. So it's much harder now to try and go for those many areas that you still lack the success in. So there's going to be limits. And honestly, it's not going to be able to power Huawei out of this, right? This is the sort of quasi-renationalization of Huawei. It's integration into Chinese civil military fusion and into, which is a buzzword I shouldn't just throw out there, but basically into Chinese national strategic priorities going forward. And Huawei Star has basically permanently fallen around the world. But it's really important to note it also has taken a lot of, it's taken massive goodwill away from the U.S. at the same time. So the U.S. targeting this company did make an impact across China, right? This is the thing the Chinese government has been propagandizing for a really long time, that the United States wants to thwart its rise and it wants to, cut it off at the knees. It wants to make it dependent. It wants to stay number one. It wants to do all these sorts of things. And it was always saying that, we're under threat and all that. And it eventually sort of came to pass in this sense, at least, where the U.S. did target and almost kill Huawei. So it's also just a random company, but this is something that is a big and is increasingly resonant and major event, really, in sort of the Chinese cultural, economic, and political psyche. Right, this is no longer a fictional sort of scenario, and I mean, there's a whole thing all across the Chinese tech sector where the whole thing is being quasi reorganized around this reality and around new Chinese social and economic and strategic priorities, which I'll talk about in another episode probably. But this is key. Basically to wrap up, Huawei is on its way to being a lot of what the U.S. feared it was. In a lot of ways, it's going to be probably more of what the U.S. feared, but less globally relevant, ideally, although not in probably not entirely. And and then in China, this what the U.S. did is exactly what the reason a company like Huawei was created and supported in the first place. So everyone's sort of getting a little bit of what they want, and hopefully you enjoyed this this little video, right? So if you enjoyed it, definitely subscribe, check it out, check out other videos, like it, comment, review, let me know what you think. And I'll probably do a bit more about the 5G stuff just because it's so overhyped, honestly. But